Well, hello there. How is everyone? I hope you are all well on this thirsty Thursday. That's it. It's Thursday, and you're looking thirsty. You're looking absolutely amazing. I will say that. But anyway, we're going to get straight into the meat and potatoes. As in this video, we are talking about there's three stories in the Idaho 4 case, really, that make up the guilt of Bryan Kohberger. Three little things that will say the guilters have hung every single thing on with respect of the belief that he's guilty already. He doesn't really need a trial because he's guilty. How can he be innocent if these three things are indeed accurate? But what I'm going to do in this video is show you that there are two sides to each of these three elements. And these three elements that we have here are the DNA hurdle, the DNA found at the scene of the crime on a knife sheath. We then have the car, his actual car, and the camera and the footage. And you know, when you think that you've got, okay, he's got his DNA at the scene and we've got his car at the scene. Again, how can this guy be innocent of this crime? And why are there people who are supporting this guy? They're completely insane. And then we have the Amazon purchase of a K-bar knife. Now, this list isn't exhaustive, but these three things, what I've seen is when I have interacted with guilters, if you like, this is the majority sort of vote in terms of this is why this guy is guilty of this crime. So let's just look at how each one of these individual elements can be framed in a certain way so you can see that it isn't just as simple as these stories exist, so he must therefore be guilty of this crime. So let's start with the DNA. Let's start with the DNA, right? So the stories told are that there was DNA found at the scene that was a statistical match with Bryan Kohberger. That's how this is being portrayed in mainstream media. This is what the majority of guilters will come back and say. There is DNA found at the crime scene that is a statistical match to Bryan Kohberger, so therefore he must have done this crime. And when you read it like that, when you see it written in that way, of course it looks hugely damning. It looks terrible, doesn't it? Because you think to yourself from a guilter's perspective, well, the guy, his DNA is at his DNA is at the scene of this crime. It was found on a knife sheath. And when you then later talk about the purchase, which we will get to, it looks even more. And this is where circumstantial evidence starts to build and the needle moves. And we've seen the loss of the likes of JB Gunner, God rest his soul, as he moves his toes into the guilter territory at 51% sure of Bryan Kohberger's guilt. No, I joke aside, the point is that this did have ramifications that turned a lot of people who were likely on the fence to believing that Bryan Kohberger certainly was the person who did this crime. There was just too many things that started to add up. So let's look at this, for instance, this DNA. What is the actual story? So not the devilish story that you're told by media, but what is the actual DNA story when you strip it all down? And that is, look, we were told that Bryan Kohberger's DNA was found during an exercise performed by the FBI after a knife sheath was found at the scene of this crime and a small sample extracted from that knife sheath and sent to various different laboratories in order for that DNA to be tested. Now, throughout that DNA's journey, the final journey that it took into the hands of the FBI, that sample actually grew in size. And then the workings out that would eventually lead to Bryan Kohberger's name being handed back over to Moscow Police Department, that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, and it has been sort of said that it doesn't exist because there's a potential that the way in which that was obtained was not completely above board, and they perhaps shouldn't have done what they did in order to get it. But the be all and end all is there is no proof that that work was completed. It's just a phrase that came from the FBI saying, this is Bryan Kohberger's name. This is someone who you need to look into. And when you pair that with the fact that there was potentially another case of interest happening around Bryan Kohberger at the same time of this, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the FBI were already aware of who Bryan Kohberger was. And it's potentially why we have heard about the likelihood of the use of stingrays, etc., in the area. Very expensive equipment used to monitor people's communications, their whereabouts, their movements. And look, what I'm saying is, and we've spoken about this previously, it's possible the FBI already had Bryan Kohberger on their radar, and it could have led them into in the wrong direction. Because lo and behold, it would later transpire that Bryan Kohberger wasn't connected to the original case, the one that Bryan Kohberger's own family had to attend a grand jury for. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, the Dana Smithers case, then do some research. Learn about what was happening in the Dana Smithers case in the background while all this was transpiring. But let's not forget that there has also been statements made throughout the court documentation that would seemingly suggest that the FBI never actually said that the DNA found on the knife sheath was in fact Bryan Kohberger's. It's just that they did some work and they gave a name. And this name ended up stopping Moscow Police Department from investigating DNA that was at the crime scene. At least 3, one being under the fingernails of Madison Mogen, one being on the stair rail, the handrail, and one being outside. And we've heard, if you again read the court documentations, that there are mentions of up to 4, possibly 5 DNA samples found at the scene of this crime that would have likely have been further investigated had it have not been for the FBI coming back to Moscow Police Department and saying, there's a name, this is someone who you need to look into that will likely yield you some results, and the rest is history. And we have a massive shitstorm around this DNA situation with specialists in this area who have said that this is problematic. And we have also seen multiple cases literally in Moscow, Idaho, or around Idaho itself, that have in the past led to wrongful convictions around DNA. And when it turns out that there was somebody else who did it, you would learn that there was DNA at the scene of the crime. So it would seem that this pattern of ignoring evidence at the scene of a crime is not a one-off. It's not. It is something that frequently happens where things get ignored and then people are wrongfully convicted, and then later on it turns out that the evidence was there all along. And was there some degree of confirmation bias that led to the conviction of this individual, which I would say that is more than likely the case. So the DNA is not conclusive evidence. It isn't a slam dunk that because Bryan Kohberger's DNA was said to be at the scene, that it absolutely was at the scene. You need to make sure that you see the trial and see how that DNA, the chain of custody, how it was obtained, why it was obtained in the manner it was. Why did they go to Pennsylvania and draw refuse from the bins at his parents, and this more strange, convoluted methodology of obtaining this DNA? The whole story seems quite elaborate when ultimately, if they knew where Bryan Kohberger was, they could have just gotten his DNA in a much easier fashion. Because let's not forget, for them to go to Bryan Kohberger's parents and extract the DNA from his parents' bins, then they already knew who Bryan Kohberger was. So they were literally just looking for his DNA. So the way in which they did it is bizarre to me. It's very, very odd. And you should ask questions. So it isn't just as simple as, oh, Bryan Kohberger's DNA was at the scene of the crime and it's a statistical match. Do you know what I mean? To the cheek swab that they eventually ended up doing. Then we have the car. Like people say, Bryan Kohberger's car, white Hyundai Elantra. White Hyundai Elantra at the scene of the crime. Bryan Kohberger just happens to drive a white Hyundai Elantra. Well, there you go. That's a coincidence, isn't it? That's the story that's pushed out to you. That's the narrative that you get. White Hyundai Elantra at the scene of the crime. Bryan Kohberger drives a white Hyundai Elantra. But what's the actual story? What's the other side of it? What is the real story around the car? You know, we can go back into, again, this devilish story of how Bryan Kohberger's phone came on and went off at a certain time and he took this specific route. We know that he did. He even went back the following day. And it feeds into that guilter narrative. But the real story is that, look, Bryan Kohberger's phone does not place him at this property. In fact, no discussions, no media proof has come out, and I say proof because it's obviously being used as proof by guilters, even where they have said that he visited this area multiple times, in excess of 20 times. The verbiage is very strategic in that it tries to mislead you into believing that he was actually at the house. With Steve Gonsalves even saying he was so close that he was touching Wi-Fi. The weaponization of Steve Gonsalves. That's going to be a video that I do tomorrow. When in actuality, Bryan Kohberger was connected to a tower that serviced an area that was up to within 100 meters of 1122 King Road, which could have been him being simply at home because of the distance between this property and his own home. We do know that there is video footage of him in this area, and Ann Taylor has raised the fact that, yes, Bryan Kohberger has been to this area. You have looked at historic records and you know where he went, why he went, how he went, what he was doing, and more importantly, you know exactly where he did not go. And it has been stated inside the courtroom itself that there was no stalk and there is no connection between Bryan Kohberger and these victims whatsoever. And when it comes to the white Hyundai Elantra, again, initially the white Hyundai Elantra was misquoted as being a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra by a professional in the FBI whose his main functionality is to look at a picture, look at footage, see a car and be able to determine what that car is. The fact that he didn't know what car that was, and we have not seen one piece of evidence, one piece of footage, not one still, not one moving image that you could look at and say that is definitely a white Hyundai Elantra 2015. That is not what we're seeing. We are seeing a car that could be. It could be a white Hyundai Elantra. It could be a Sonata. Because of the way in which this camera system works, the car could be another colour. It may not even be the same colour as Bryan Kohberger's car. We also know that where they've plotted this route that takes him from his home to this house, that is under huge scrutiny by a cellular expert who has basically said, you cannot say that. The route that you have plotted for this guy, for you to be able to say that, you have to have this specific data, and that specific data is missing. But what's interesting is, I know you have that data. I know that you have specific data that could indeed indicate exactly where Bryan Kohberger was, but you seem to be suggesting that you don't have it, that you weren't able to get it. But I know otherwise. So why would that data be being hidden? The only reason that that data would be being hidden is if the data exists. And when you add that data into what you are trying to do, which is to locate this individual, it places him outside of what you have said. And that is problematic. So the fact that they are saying that there's a white Hyundai Elantra around the scene of this crime, and the person who did this crime drove a white Hyundai Elantra, again, I don't think that that story is a slam dunk. I don't think that that has gone through the trial and been scrutinized enough and been looked at enough. Let's not forget that Bryan Kohberger's car was tested for DNA and they found nothing. And not only did they not find anything, but they found no evidence of an attempt to cover up anything either. So a car that was once quoted as being a potential petri dish of DNA and a gold mine of evidence, it yielded nothing. No results whatsoever. And if you look at all the search returns, it would seem that that was the case across the board. There is no evidence. There is no connection. There is nothing that connects Bryan Kohberger to these victims whatsoever, as per court documentations and hearings. Which then brings us to the last one that we're going to touch on in this video. Because again, these are not exhaustive. What I'm trying to point out is the simple stories that get put out that have been turned into these bigger stories and framed as Bryan Kohberger as being guilty. If you really dig into them and take your time with them, you will understand that they are far from definitive and therefore not beyond a reasonable doubt. But like I say, this final one is the knife sheath purchase, the knife sheath and sharpener purchase that happened approximately 8 months before this crime. The reality is we've seen one side of the story. We've seen one thing that gives us a bare bones version. He bought knife sheath and bought sharpener. And that's all we know. But that small detail has been enough to tip many people over the edge. Like I say, JB Gunner, gone. Rest in peace. He is in the dark side now. When in actuality, we know nothing about that. Absolutely nothing about it whatsoever. They've said K-bar, but there's multiple types amongst their range. We don't know if what he purchased is a match for what was used. We don't know if there was multiple weapons used. We don't really even know if the weapon that was used that did the fatal blows was a K-bar. We've been conditioned to believe it was, but we don't know that. We've not even been given that information. All we know is that there is no murder weapon found. Again, that is presumptuous because I would feel that if there was, it would be known by now. But there doesn't appear to be a murder weapon found. And there have been multiple people who have suggested that there could have been multiple weapons involved. So with respect of what Bryan Kohberger purchased and what he didn't purchase, that is something that we do not know the full details of. But what we do know is Bryan Kohberger was an outdoorsy person. He was a runner. He was a hiker. He liked being outdoors. And look, the K-bar knife is one of the most popular knives to purchase across the United States of America. Literally hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of them are sold monthly. So just because he made a purchase, it doesn't automatically make him a killer. And even scrubbing that, the point being is we don't know the entire story. We don't know if he still has it. We don't know if he sold it and can prove it. We don't know if it was bought as a gift for somebody else. We know nothing. So if that piece of information has single-handedly tipped you over the edge, what I'm saying is that was... you did it too early. You jumped too early. So I'd just say, look, wait, hold on. Don't be so quick to judge. Don't be so quick to decide that somebody deserves to die, to lose their life, because you heard part of a story that, when attached to multiple stories that are only part of a story and have questions, that's enough? Because I don't think it is. I think if you're looking to execute someone, then you should do absolutely every single thing in your power to keep them alive. And and if you're going to go down the route of execution, which that in itself is a debate, but if you are going to go down the route of execution, then that execution should be the result of not being able to escape it. There is no alternative. It is beyond a reasonable doubt. So I will ask you one final question. If you are a guilter, do you believe that the reason that you are in your mind in a position right now to say Bryan Kohberger is guilty of this crime? I want you to ask this question and say, if someone held a gun to your head and said, is the reason you're given for Bryan Kohberger enough to execute him? Is it really, truly beyond a reasonable doubt? And you would put your own life on it. What would you say if your own life was on the line and you had to make that same decision? Let me know down below. I'll catch you all in the next one. Mwah.